And
Can I just remind everyone to please mute yourselves until sort of question time, if you wouldn't mind?
oh, okay, great. Thanks, Jackie.
No worries.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. Okay, so this is Plato's Theaetetus, autumn 2021, session 4, between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Now, I just wanted to mention, last time I said, oh, I'm going to give you a bit of an intro to, oh, and there's Helen. Hi, Helen. I'm just going to, and John, I'm just going to keep talking here. So I said I was going to give you a bit of an introduction to Parmenides, but actually when I said that, I'd forgotten what's going on here, because what happens is we get the Heraclitean stuff, as those folks who've managed to get through it, we get that, and then there's a move to Parmenides, and then the move to Parmenides doesn't happen, which is an interesting thing that's going on in the dialogue, which we'll get to soon. So we get the Heraclitus side, all this flux, all this change, and then we only get the Parmenides side in this cryptic sort of way, and where there's a bit of an introduction to Plato's elementary forms. So there you go. So we'll have to wait another time for that. And for those people who just arrived, the decision has been made. We are going to continue with, whether you want to come or not, we're going to continue with the Sophist, which is the continuation of this in winter. So that will be starting on Tuesday. I'll put a booking form up on the website in the next few days. Tuesdays evenings online again, so we can get everyone from I think it must be the 22nd of June, but I can give you those details later. So, and this is where actually we're being pushed off to in this passage where we don't talk about Parmenides. So I'll tell you a bit about that when we get to it. It's kind of interesting what's going on there. Now, what I thought I might do, just with me reflecting on how we've been going, getting into this material, that I thought, Demetra, can you turn, hi Demetra, and can you, that's great.
Yep,
That's
hi,
great.
sorry.
Okay, we'll see you, yeah, I'll speak later. Okay, so I just thought that I'm just reflecting on, we're suddenly going into all this discussion about the observer and the observed, about experience, thinking, and all that sort of thing. And it's kind of really important to relate that to your own reflections on your own consciousness and your own experience and so on. And because if we're just talking about it in this kind of abstract way, and you're not reflecting on your own knowledge of yourself and your own consciousness, then it's hard to engage with the text. It's hard enough to engage with the text with the use of terms that we get in this text that we have to kind of reinterpret. So what I thought we might start with today is with a little of an exercise that might engage you with this notion of what I'm calling observer and observed. Now I'm going to use different words for that. But let's just say that's what it's about. So it's about consciousness, if you like, or experience, whatever you want to call it. So, the observer we can think of as consciousness. The observed is your experience, or as an extension, the experience of a sensible object. So you have your experience, and then you could say, well, you have your experience of a sensible object, right? In Theaetetus, observer and observed are cryptically referred to as the passive motion, the observer, and the active motion, the observed. So that's a confusion in itself. You know, write that down if you go back and reread it, because there's a reason for that, because it's all this flux theory. But anyway, that in itself is confusing. So this observer is the passive motion, and active motion is the observed, or the experiencer and the experienced. So it's not, as I was saying, it's not really good to talk about this unless you can relate it to what you already know about yourself. Okay, And so what I thought we'd do is do a little bit of an exercise. And now I'll take you through it. It'll be kind of like a simulation of something that you could do at another time, but we can kind of simulate it here. And perhaps if people are okay with that, with going through it, then it might be helpful also while you're doing it to close your eyes. So it's just up to you. And it'll just take a few minutes. And we just want to get into a reflection on consciousness and observer and observed. So in doing this exercise, it's good to find a quiet place where you're not distracted. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be silent. I mean, it's impossible to find somewhere silent, right? But what is really important and really helpful is to be somewhere where you don't hear spoken word, you don't hear talk, TV, radio, something like that. That's really distracting for an exercise like this. Many folks might find it easy to close their eyes, be still, and notice the thoughts in your consciousness. Thoughts about things you need to do, what you're doing now. What's this mean that Bernie's talking about? Your worries for the day, remembering what you need to buy at the shops or what you're going to have for dinner. These thoughts, I don't know what they are. They go through your head all the time, right? Let the thoughts settle. It's not easy for that, and it's not something that you can force, and it takes time. After a while, when your thoughts are quiet, notice how perceptions are coming into your consciousness. So there are thoughts. What am I going to cook for dinner? And there are perceptions. These perceptions might be sounds, noises near or far. Or notice the feeling of pressure on your skin where you're sitting. Pay attention to that dull ache in your bones somewhere. Am I feeling hungry? Taste in your mouth. The sound of your breath. Some folks actually find paying attention to particular sensations is what helps them quieten their thoughts. If your thoughts are quiet enough, you can move from attention to your thoughts to attention to perceptions or experiences. This does not come easily. It's about trying to go from your thoughts. It's about trying to let go of your thoughts, not to stop them, not trying to stop them, but letting them go. This may take some time, especially if you have been agitated by a busy day. Okay, so the next step is to consider these experiences, these perceptions, as disembodied, to consider them as pure experience. Again, this is a letting go, an unlearning, if you like. For some folks, it's easy to do this with sound. When I hear a sound, I usually situate it in my world. There's people sounds, people down the hall, people next door. There's machine sounds, the traffic, the aircon, bird sounds, the rain, the wind in the trees. Is that the sound of the sea or a wet freeway? Is that a backfire or a gunshot? Is that the rustling of my clothes or some great sound far away? Stop doing that. Stop placing the sound in my world. Just listen to the sound, as it rings in my ear. The pure sound, not as it is embodied in something in my world, not placed in my world, not the sound of something, just the sound ringing in my ear. Once I get to that, it takes some practice. But once I get to paying attention to my consciousness as an observer of those sounds, of my experience, this is as close as I can get to elementary experiencing, as though newborn to my experience. This is consciousness, or the observer eye. This is what people are talking about when they're talking about this. And the sounds are the observations. So you've got the observer and the observed, the experiencer and the experience, the perceiver and the perceived. What you may see when you're in this state is how I construct my world, how I make sense of my experience by placing these sounds in my world. I make sense of my experience by placing these sounds in my world. And so for all my experiences, I build my world from my experiences using, well, Plato would say, using elementary forms, same and different, like unlike, equal unequal, greater lesser. You know these: being not being, static dynamic, unchanging changing. I use the forms of differentiation to build my world, to place my everyday experiences, my experiences of my consciousness, to place them in that world. That sound, is it a bird making that sound? That rumble, oh, that's the train over there. That hissing, is it the aircon or the wet freeway? Oh, it's the sea, I'm on holidays, I forgot. I place my experiences in my world. My world is constructed from my experiences, from, as Plato would say, a construction from the most elementary forms that I always already knew. Now that's going pretty deep, right? But we can go there. And there's just one more thing before we finish this. Notice what is basic to all this. Very basic to observation of my experience is the distinction I make between observer and observed. What I observe is not I. What I observe is not I. What I observe is other to the I, other to the world that I experiences. The I, has made that separation, the distinction of not I, that which I am conscious of, that which my consciousness is conscious of. Plato's mind's eye, observing its experiences of itself as distinct from itself. The ringing in the ear is me. My experience is other, but it's also me. So that's the end of the exercise. If you've closed your eyes, you can open them now. And you can turn off your mute. And I'm hearing all this noise.
That was absolutely fascinating for me, Bernie. Are you okay to take, okay. A spiritual teacher once said to me that we're looking when we meditate for the knower and the known. And it was very similar to what you were bringing up there. But you were using different words, and it's the consciousness, and, you know, the one that knows, as opposed to the one who is being known. And yet we're also looking within from that. Whether it's deeper, whether it's higher, it doesn't really matter. Higher, deeper, for me is same thing. But I just love the, if I understood correctly, where you were talking about my experience is within me, but also is me. Did I get that?
Well, there's also other to you,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Because the experiencing I experiences it as other. Now, when you go to materialism,
Yeah, right.
you
Yeah.
project that other to be absolutely external.
Yes. Yes.
But not in Platonism. Yeah. And saying knower and known is perfectly relevant to us because we are doing epistemology here, aren't we? And perception is being identified at this point until it's exploded apart with knowing. Knowledge is perception. That's what's being explored. Yeah. So thanks for that, Jackie. Anyone else got any reflections? Or questions?
I stepped out and I was observing myself.
Yes. Yes, you can observe yourself observing, and you can observe yourself observing yourself observing. Yes, and an exercise like this is all about coming down to the level of pure observation, which, you know, dare I say it, yeah, is coming into a presence with your experience, you know, rather than analyzing or thinking about it. And so the point of putting the exercise in here is to say, this is what we're talking about. This is what's at stake, and this is what we're trying to understand. That's what Plato, writing 2,400 years ago, is trying to engage with this stuff that we already know about ourselves. And so when we're reading this or interpreting it, the way we need to reflect on it is reflect on how, you know, like you read it and you say, oh, he says it works that way. And then you can go back into a dark room, a quiet time, and contemplate your own experience yourself. Because ultimately, this is what it all comes back to. Otherwise, it's just words. Yeah, so
I don't know if anybody struggled with it. Is it okay for me to ask that?
With the exercise, do you mean?
Yeah.
This exercise?
Because sometimes it's difficult to face ourselves, like our thoughts. I'm just curious.
If you've done meditation and those sorts of things, it kind of fits with that.
Yes.
It does.
Yeah, but if you've done meditation, a lot of sorts of meditation, some of that would be quite familiar to you. You wouldn't necessarily be focusing on sound, but yeah, you can reflect on that. So the key point here, I suppose, is again to say that this is where Plato's trying to engage with us, right? He's trying to engage with us in if you do meditation, in what you experience and what your awareness of your consciousness in meditation, because this is what you're coming back to, this more elementary level of your experience. You're trying to understand what experience is exactly, what it is that I experience, what it is that I perceive, if you want to use those terms, what it is that I know. And
That's all very subjective.
Say that again, Mary.
It is all very subjective, what you perceive.
That.
And it has to, where does it fit into the scheme of your experiences and what you've been exposed to? That defines it, I think.
Right. Well, your particular experiences might be different from other people's particular. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But it's like Viktor Frankl, when he wrote about, he said, why was it that some people survived, a horrific experience like the Holocaust and others didn't? And a lot of it came down to your attitude and whether you gave up or found your quiet place. I'm sure that's in a very simplistic term, but if you could just manage your emotions, so to speak.
Oh, okay. So it's sort of like putting up with something in a mental way.
Yes.
Some people lose the plot. So okay,
yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's.
You can't change what happens to you, but you can somehow control your reaction to a situation.
You can't, to a certain extent, you can't change your experience. So the causation of your experience, to a certain extent, is external.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what's being denied in Platonism. So people come from the outside to Platonism and a lot of other idealistic philosophies, as it's called, and say, well, you're just building castles in the air and you're denying the reality of objects. You're not denying the reality of objects. You're saying that you construct the objects within your experience, within you. But in saying that, you're not saying that there's no external causation of them. If you can draw that distinction, that's the critical distinction that people from the outside of Platonism don't understand. It's not saying that you absolutely cause your experience. In some ways you do, of course. In some ways you do cause your experience.
Your reaction, really, isn't it? And how your reaction to that experience.
Well, yes, it can be like making a distinction between, the sound of a train and the sound of, or the sound of a freeway and the sound of the sea, or something like that. That's a subtle distinction that we make. So that's an active thing we do. And we can go back to, and I'll introduce a term that's used in modern post-Kantian Immanuel Kant, so Enlightenment philosophy, which is sense data. So when you're getting down to the elementary experience, when I was talking about disembodied experience, like the way the sound actually, vibrates your ear, right? That's called sense data. Or you might say the yellow of my cup is sense data. So we'll get to that today, where we're talking about, Plato talks about this, where he says, well, the sense data in my eyes is different from the sense data that I get from my tongue. He's not saying sense data, but this is what this is the sort of thing he's talking about. And so in modern philosophy, you talk about sense data, talking about your primary experiences. So you might say the experience of yellow, or with Plato, it was, I think, the white stone or something, the whiteness of the stone. So that's sense data. Okay. All right. So I might move on, and something that a slide I didn't show last week, and it relates to what we're talking about right now, on the in-between theory. Remember the secret theory of in-between. So that perception happens in between the observer and the observed. So we've got an idea of observer and observed. And of course, we can see this in different ways. And modern materialism sees it differently to Plato. And this is seeing it in a similar way to modern materialism, where it's something that happens in between the observer and the observed. The cup in itself as something external and independent from me, my perceptions, the sensible cup, the cup that that's in my experience, is in between. Okay, but in that we'll refer directly to the in-between theory of that Plato is talking about here. Okay, so, and I'll just go through this slide here. So knowledge, perception is in between observer and observed. Okay, so this is how Plato deals with it. I know everything by perception. So perception is knowledge. This is the fundamental theory of knowledge that we started with and we keep playing with through here. Or I know it as it appears in my perception. I know it as it appears in my perception as color, hardness, that sort of thing. So perception happens in between the observer, my seeing eye, which was used in this passage, and the observed, my cup. Okay. But how do I know the observed object itself, my cup, even that it exists? The answer is I don't know it. I don't know the cup itself. I only know it as it appears in my perception, because that is the only way that I know. So the observed object itself is only known as it is perceived, as it appears. And so too, the observer. So those between which perception happens, the observer and the observed object, are also themselves only perceived. They are also in-betweens. So perception happens in between other in-betweens. And so it's in-betweens all the way down. And this is how the theory eats itself. Okay, so it's a very similar, the critique of this theory is very similar critique that brings up skepticism throughout history, and including modern skepticism of famous French philosopher called Jacques Derrida. A very similar thing occurs with his analysis of language and of signs in general. Okay, so one of the difficulties with reading what we're reading now is how does this perception theory relate to this Heraclitian theory of change, that everything's changing all the time and it's in flux, right? Now, the link seems quite tenuous, and don't worry too much if you don't see it. But what is important to see, and we'll see at the end of the reading today, is that both theories, the particular things that we're talking about, that knowledge is supposed to be about, are hard to pin down. Every time you think you're grasping the thing, it falls out of your hands. It becomes another in-between in this case. The objects of perception escape you. The known object keeps falling away. Both theories have this extreme relativism, this extreme flux, where language even breaks down because one can't refer to objects in saying that they exist. You can't say this or that, right? Because they keep becoming something else. Or they keep becoming something else in the flux theory, in the perception theory, they keep being other in-betweens. So we'll come to this right at the end of the reading, but that is kind of the link. And it's a bit difficult and a bit tenuous, but where it is connected is in a formal way, right? They both have the same form and they both have the same formal consequence, which is a descent into skepticism. So we'll get to that. But before we get to today's reading, are there any questions or comments or reflections on anything we've said so far? Just maybe something that wasn't clear there. Fire away. Okay, we're happy with that? Great. All right, so we're getting to today's reading then. So I'll just start a little bit back, a couple of paragraphs back in that. Remember that digression at the end of last week's reading, week 3, the digression about the philosopher's way, you know, that stuff about thinking like a lawyer and you're a slave to the argument, and thinking like a philosopher where the argument is your slave. Well, towards the end of that, at 176, Theaetetus says, excuse me, if you persuade all men of the truth of what you're saying, Socrates, there would be more peace and less bad in the world. Socrates responds, it's impossible to destroy the bad because there must always be something opposed to the good. Now, this sounds a bit Manichaeism if people know that, but he clarifies and he says that we're talking here about mortal nature, not divine nature. Therefore, we ought to escape the mortal nature towards the dwelling place of the gods as quickly as we can to be ourselves godlike. This is sounding a bit like the Phaedo, right? This is what should be pursued. Don't pursue virtue just to be seen to be virtuous in society. It has its advantages, but don't do that. Remember the Republic for those people who have read that. Instead, become godlike and thereby become good. Okay, so once you become divine, once you become what a philosopher desires, tries to become, then goodness and virtue will naturally come. You won't be trying to be virtuous, you just will be. And at page 177, Socrates says that there are 2 set paths for life. Remember here it gets very binary, the good and the bad path. Those that follow the bad way pay the price by living a wretched life. And then he kind of says, well, how can we save them? You know, it's about like, what's a good education? If we tell them the stories of reward in the afterlife, then they won't believe us. They will think us fools. So we're the fools, not them. So remember the myths of the afterlife in the Phaedo? He says, it's a good thing for me to tell this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's a good thing to tell me this story because I'm about to die, right? So those sorts of myths, right, they don't work with these people. But he says there's another way. When they carry on a personal discourse, since they're in page 177, when they carry on a personal discourse, so this is like a private logos. A private logos, when you carry on a personal discourse about the philosopher's way, and if they stick at it, so you've got to persist with it and not just walk away, then at long last, they become strangely dissatisfied with themselves, and their arguments wither away, and they become no better than children. I'm not sure whether they get converted to this philosopher's way here. I'm not sure exactly what he's saying, but it's an interesting passage that's probably worth reading if you get a chance. But anyway, right at this point when he says that, their arguments wither away and it becomes like children, Socrates stops himself and says, oh, but this is the digression. Let's get back to what we were talking about. And so he does. And we come back again to this is appearance is knowledge question, and we come back to it in relation to social knowledge, a society knowing truths. So Socrates seems to agree that this works, saying that what a society appears to a society to be true is true. So appearance is true in terms of religious beliefs and cultural customs everywhere, in those sorts of things. In such cases, what is right because, well, the society sets its own standards, right? It's right for the culture, so it's right. But not for other matters. Other matters such as what is best in terms of, say, defense or security of the society, the sorts of things where you might refer to an expert for advice, well, you can say there's right and wrong, there's good and bad. That was a good strategy. That was a good choice or decision or whatever. So there's good and bad judgments. So the society can sometimes make bad judgments. So the society is not always its best judge of a situation. So there is something beyond, in truth, that's beyond the appearance of truth for society. And this is often where judgment concerns what will happen in the future. Remember this section? And so from making rules for society, so Anastasia, legislation, we can all agree that there are good laws and bad ones, right? So what appears true and right to someone isn't necessarily right, because it might be a bad law. It might be a bad judgment about what is a good law. Even if we don't agree what a good one is, we know that there are good and bad laws. So there's judgment, and some are better than others in making these judgments. And not only for society. A doctor would be a better judge than a patient of how to treat the patient's illness. Experts are better judges on some things. The musician is a better judge of the music in terms of making the music that I might like, right? Because I can't do it. But then what about Protagoras? As an expert debater, he would be a better judge of what will be persuasive in the court. If you're on trial, right? You know, your lawyer will be a better judge of what will be persuasive, or in the Senate. So here we enter layers of contradiction that Plato is bringing up on this theory. So if I, Socrates, know nothing and defer to the expert, Protagoras, then perhaps I'm violating the dictum that I must be the measure of my own judgment. And, you know, Protagoras, maybe I'm deferring to the expert, well, Protagoras knows best, but I am the measure of my own truth. So contradictions there, or my opinion that other opinions are true might be true, my opinion that other opinions are true might be the opinion that your opinion is false. Someone else has an opinion that your opinion is false. So does that make me the measure of my truth? Or you the measure of yours? Then we come to the not entirely seamless segue that brings in the Heraclitian doctrine, that all is in motion. And Theaetetus gives a rather scathing, Theodorus, remember Theodorus is coming in here and helping out with the discussion, reluctantly. Theodorus gives a rather scathing assessment of the followers of Heraclitus that are around at the time. So Heraclitus is dead and he's got all these followers apparently, and they're always evasive. He said they're always, you know, you try and pin them down, they always just jump away and say, oh, no. And so it presents as kind of like a skeptical position that these people really don't want to pin anything down. So we've come to now page 180E. We're presented with these opposition between the two rather polarized camps, right? We've got the school of thought in Plato, so the two schools of thought in Plato's time. You know, apparently, we don't really know. The Heraclitians, all is motion, and the Parmenideans, the followers of Parmenides, the Eleatic philosophers, and the Megaran philosophers that we've been talking about, sorry, I've just got something come up on my screen. Just close that. In this discussion, in discussing the Heraclitians, Socrates talks of two types of motion in space and alternation. So how things move, like say, I throw an apple, and how they change in themselves. the apple is slowly rotting. So he's trying to get both senses of motion. This is kinesis, has this broader sense of change, as opposed to just moving in space. It's also change, as in the apple rotting, or something, a rock slowly transforming into another form, something like that. So he says that the theory of constant flux demands that both these things must be happening at the same time. So he's really pushing the Heracliteans to really be really serious and thorough in their position, to show how it's problematic. Thus, he presents it as extreme, shows how indeed it is contradictory to say that all things change when there is no way of establishing the thingness of the things referred to. If you say all things change or all is change, then you can't refer to anything that's changing because it escapes from you. There's a sense in which if you're saying things change, there must be things that change. It can't all be change. Really, that's what he's getting at. And so you can see how this relates now to the in-between theory that I showed on the slide and so forth. The same thing happens with the in-between theory, is that with this theory, you say that all is change, but then you have trouble sort of saying, well, what there is that changes, and you can't pin anything down, and you can't pin anything down, so it all becomes just meaningless and skeptical. In the same way as you say that all is perception, all knowledge is perception, and that happens in between the observer and the observed. But then how do I know the observer and the observed? Well, I know them also through perception, and the whole thing collapses. So we can see again how it's all, if they're thorough enough, both these views end up in an absolutely thorough skepticism where you say, well, look, I don't know anything. And he relates these two doctrines this is on page 182, and I'm just going to read from that now, because it's an important passage. Okay. All right. So this is 182, the end of C. If things were only moving, but not altering, we would be able to describe the qualities of the moving thing as they flow, wouldn't we? Yes. But since it isn't even the case that something in flux remains flowing white, since it changes and there turns out to be flux even of the whiteness, and to be changed to another color, otherwise one could pinpoint it as stable in this respect, so it wouldn't be changing. Then it is ever possible to name the color of anything. Then is it ever possible to name the color of anything with any hope of being correct? Impossible. Socrates, and equally impossible for anything like that, given that since it is flowing, it is slipping away even while one is speaking. So now he shifts to perception theory. And what shall we say about perception? About seeing and hearing, for example. Is it ever stably just the seeing or just the hearing, that hearing? No, it can't be if everything is changing. So he's relating the two theories. So if everything is changing in all respects, we shouldn't talk of seeing something rather than not seeing it. Seeing whiteness as more white than not white, for example. Okay. We shouldn't talk of seeing something rather than not seeing it. And any other perception is no more perception than not perception. No. Now, Socrates then says a bit later, therefore, when we were asked to define knowledge? Our answer, knowledge is perception, names something which is no more knowledge than not knowledge. Okay, so it's in this way the theory is has completely collapsed.
Can I ask a question? I find that really difficult to understand. Is there a simple way of trying to articulate what he's trying to say there?
Okay, so he's with the change theory. What he's saying is that if you say that all is change, then you can't refer to any of the things that are changing, because then you would say that there is something that is not changing, right? Because if you can refer to it, if you can refer to whiteness, for example, whiteness is changing to be something else. It's always changing. So you can't refer to it as whiteness because it will, even as you're speaking about it, it's changing in some way to being not itself.
What's an example then of that? Because not everything changes. I mean, it will change eventually over a long time. But for example, a wall that's painted white is not going to change for a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a particular theory, the Heraclitian theory, which is saying that there is nothing that is stable in itself, right? There's nothing, you can't pin down anything to say that it is itself and it's at rest and it's staying the same. And because you can't do that, in principle, then all things are changing. The problem with it is that you can't actually refer, according to Plato, the problem is that you can't actually refer to anything because you can't pin anything down because nothing is ever itself. It's always becoming not itself.
So in life, what is the significance of that?
Well, it's really about trying to ground your knowledge, I suppose, trying to ground your knowledge in something. And so remember, we were trying to say maybe we ground our knowledge in the external object of knowing, right? The object in itself. Or Plato tries to ground it in his forms theory, that the forms, the insensible forms, are the essential being, and that our experience is actually just a projection of that. The Heraclitian view seems, if you like, well, only descends into a skepticism on Plato's criticism here, whether we agree to that or not. He's saying that if you say that all is change, then there's no thingness of things you're referring to that are changing, because they themselves are changing. And so they're becoming, in some way, not themselves. If you say that the thing you refer to is itself and not becoming something else, then you're saying that in some sense, well, that thing, that quality of that thing is not changing.
And the significance of that to life or to knowledge? Is it?
I don't know. Maybe there is no significant. Maybe there's maybe it's not worth dwelling on. I don't know.
Did these philosophers ever? I'm sure it would be somewhere that the self, the inner self, never changes, and it's the source of truth and the source of knowledge. Has that ever come up in your studies?
Well, what do you think Plato's view is on that?
Yeah. Yep.
Mm.
I'm wondering whether, just picking up on Mary's point, could we apply it to the following example, where we might be judgmental of someone in describing them as being a certain type of person without taking into account that they might actually have different reactions to different situations. So you know, there are actually a number of different personalities within the person. It's just a concrete example that comes to mind, that can you really describe a person? Can you pigeonhole them?
I think that's a good example actually that might work for us, Avula, because when you're talking to someone about a particular topic, you know, like maybe you're talking about psychology or whatever, and the person you're talking to says, well, you know, how do you know that? It mightn't be exactly like that, or it might be some other way, or it might have been that way moments, you know, last week, but it's not that way now. Or you know, and you might even in consultation see how people go to this kind of evasive position, and this happens in philosophy all the time. And these are two positions that were around in Plato's time, the Heraclitian tradition, all is flux, and this other position that's related to Protagoras, that where you get evasive. You get evasive, and you say, well, you just say, oh, well, you know, my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth, that's it, right? Or you say, you know, that perception is what happens in between, and that's it. Well, what about this other stuff? Well, it doesn't work, and then it all. What about the observer and the observed? And then that one collapses. So the Heraclitian position, I suppose, and Theodoros goes on about this. I mean, oh, these people, you know, you try and pin them down, and they keep saying, and they're all really evasive. So that's the kind of the evasive one. And you get this in modern skepticism. Followers of Derrida often like this, and then 16th century skepticism is often like this. We know nothing. We know nothing. We can't pin anything down. Everything's changing all the time. And we can't say that anything is solid, right?
Except for what Anastasia said about the inner truth and the inner self.
Okay, so Mary, this is exactly the point, right? This is exactly what's going on here with us doing this Theaetetus and moving on to the Sophist next, right? Okay, this is Plato saying pointing down doesn't work. Okay, pointing down doesn't work. Pointing up, which we call pointing in, does work. It's actually, you know, Anastasia presumed my what my answer was to the question. There is a constancy to the psyche in Plato, but there's a constancy that goes beyond that, right? So if you talk about the individual psyche, the individual soul, that is a constancy for me as an observer, right? There's a certain constancy there, which is an interesting thing to think about in terms of, was it constant all the way back to when I was 2 years old, when I was 1 day old? That center of consciousness, that psyche, is it there all the way? But for Plato, there is a constancy that goes beyond that, right? Which is the constancy of the forms, okay, and the form of forms, all right, which we're going to get to today. How are we going? Yeah, we should be right. Okay, look, I hope that's helpful. I hope I gave justice, Mary, to what Plato was doing with the Heraclitian position, but it would be perfectly okay to sort of go, well, what the hell, these guys are, you know, these Heraclitians are mad. You know, they're evasive, and but he's really trying to destroy the theory. That's the main thing.
I actually find Heraclitus of nothing ever staying still, and ever changing. Everything is ever changing, and nothing remains still, is really profound.
Well, if it's the case, Kula, let's play with this. If it's the case, then what thing are you talking about?
Well, this
is that when you say everything, let's say one thing. If we say one thing, if it's always changing, then is it really a thing?
Well,
Changing to be something else.
well, he says there is no is. I think that sort of explains it.
If I just interrupt, what Plato's saying is that is problematic, not just with language, because you can't say this, that, and the other thing, right? You can't say it and this exists and that doesn't exist. You can't say any of that. So it's a problem with language, but it's a problem fundamentally with philosophy. If you say all is change, then you're saying that there's nothing that is being changed, right? Because if you say everything is changing all the time, but it has some constancy to it, then that's all right. But these Heraclitians are going very extreme and saying all is changed, all being is changed. But what is it that is changing? Well, that's change itself. So you can't pin it down. You can't say anything is. This is the problem Plato's pointing to. Maybe you don't agree with it.
I'm thinking about it.
Okay. Well, keep thinking about it, and we'll have. Oh, you go on. Someone else.
Yes, sorry, Bernie. Dimitra put a couple of comments in here. So this was when you were talking to Mary and Anastasia. How to apply it practically in life may not be to assume everything is static or unchanging. And in that way, it could help heighten one's sense of appreciation and value of that thing, movement, whatever.
Do you want to speak to that a bit more, Dimitra?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just aware that Mary is conscious of what's the point of those theories or looking at them. And for me, they're all just searching and trying to get to the, essence of stuff. And for other people, it's important that you can actually use that, or it resonates in some way. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But for me, that sort of stuff is, it can be at that higher level where you're absorbed in the process or the thinking. But practically, things do change. That white wall of paint is changing as we speak. We just don't sense it or see it. But that's not important from our perspective, but it's important not to assume that it's going to remain static. So if you apply it more generally, then maybe it's important not to assume that my relationship is going to remain static, or my job is going to remain static, or, other things. So keeping that sense of openness in your life so that you can be receptive and responsive appropriately might be something that you can get from it. And we saw last year, certainly, in one really quick swoop, everything shifted really quickly, and it can any other time. And so you can take from it, what you personally see. And I think there are elements that are valid in his theory that are not absolute or totally encompassing is the word I'm looking for, and that integrate with elements of the other theories as well. I don't think any of the theories really do it all, but you can take little bits.
They certainly don't. They certainly don't. No. And let me just be clear on this, right? If I say, oh yeah, everything's changing all the time, even those rocks there, they're slowly transforming, the atoms are breaking off, my apple is rotting slowly, my body's changing all the time, this desk is changing all the time, right? That's not the Heraclitian theory. It's more extreme than that, right? Because you're saying that there is a desk, right? You're saying that there is an apple and all that, but they say it's change all the way down. Now, look, let's not worry anymore about that, but just to say that it is that extreme, that theory and the theory of perception, which is not a skepticism, the in-between theory, ends up in the abyss, and he puts them in the abyss in this passage. You may not agree with it or think that it's relevant. I did say that this dialogue is much more philosophical, if you like, not practical, right? It's really trying to understand what it is to know, right? What's the foundation of what it is to know? Okay, so he trashes all these. Theodorus says, well, there, I'm done. Remember Theodorus, you know, he pitched in, he said, okay, I'll help out while I'm going to defend, I'm going to ask the questions when we're talking about my mate Protagoras, because his old mate Protagoras is dead now, but he's going to stand in for him and help out. And so he said, well, I'm done now. I've had enough. Can I please be relieved of questioning? And then Theaetetus says, no, not now. Remember your commitment. You said you'd do both sides. You said you would do the Heraclitian, all is changed, and the Parmenidean side, nothing changes. Theodorus says, well, look, Theaetetus, can you please take over? I've had enough. You know, I guess his mate's been smashed to pieces, hasn't he? So he's kind of feeling a bit down about that. And he's getting old, and his mind, he's saying Theaetetus is a much better young mind for this. So Theaetetus agrees, but then Socrates backs away and he says, I won't comply. Theodorus, why not? You usually can't resist going into a cavalry charge in an open field. You know, like Socrates just loves a bit of an argument, a bit of a debate. And then there's this really interesting passage that I'll read out now, and then we can talk about. So Theodorus asks, why not? Why aren't you now going to talk about Parmenides, Parmenidean theory, and the theory also of Melesius? So this is, you don't have to read it now, but this is 183, or was it 184? 183, right at the end, about Eve. My respect for Melesius and for the other proponents of the view that the universe is one being and at rest makes me want to avoid a shoddy inquiry into their theory. And there is one being above all that I respect, Parmenides. To my eyes, Parmenides is, in the words of Homer, worthy of esteem and awe. You see, I met him once when I was quite young and he was quite old, and I was impressed by a certain depth in him that struck me as altogether noble, so I am afraid of us not understanding what he said and failing even to grasp the intention underlying what he said. The intention underlying what he said. So here we have a reference to the other two dialogues in our triangle. Remember our triangle, right? So the Theaetetus is followed by the Sophist, and there's also the Parmenides. And in the Parmenides, there's the young Socrates, very young Socrates. It has to be very young because Parmenides died. Actually, it doesn't really work, but I think Parmenides might have even died before Socrates was born. But there's this reference to Parmenides where in the Parmenides, the dialogue of Parmenides, Parmenides is schooling the young Socrates on the higher dialectic, on the discussion of the higher forms. Okay, and then in the Sophist, there is the answer to Parmenides. So he deflects the discussion here so that he can have a more serious, in-depth discussion. This is the understanding of this passage in these other two dialogues. Okay, so that's probably all I need to say about that passage. Yeah, so I might just keep moving on unless someone's got any questions, because time is moving on. So yeah, directly after this, right, we get the introduction So after putting the discussion of Parmenides aside, Socrates moves the discussion towards these elementary forms that are discussed in these other dialogues, in the Parmenides and in the Sophists. This is how he does it. Do we see with the eyes or by means of the eyes? Do we hear with the ears or by means of the ears? Now at 184D, we are asked to consider what is it that actually does the perceiving? The psyche, the soul, the mind's eye, the psyche perceives by means of the organs. Now, remember our earlier discussion, our exercise with consciousness. The psyche, the mind's eye, perceives by means of the organs. The observer eye, Plato's mind's eye. Here we get a notion of sense data as the elementary perceptions, right? If you got to this passage, if you didn't get this passage, read it again. It's really important. Things that are perceived by one faculty and not by the other. So, you know, the taste, right? You can't see a taste. You can't hear a color. So this is the primary sense data we were talking about earlier. But if something occurs to you, so if something occurs to you about both taste and sight, this looks like honey, this smells like honey, it is honey, right? Any Pooh Bear fans? It cannot be perception, right? So perception is knowledge. This can't be perception. So this is where Plato introduces elementary formal opposites. In this passage here, and go back to it if you haven't got that far. It's around page 185b. Okay, so in post-Kantian philosophy, in modern philosophy, we're talking here about a priori knowledge, knowledge that is prior to or independent from experience, perhaps independent from sensible experience, but let's just say that. So what do we get here? We get being, not being. We get other, same. We get like, unlike. These are familiar to you. Unity and polarity. And then he goes on to add even and odd, which is Plato's way of saying the counting numbers. And then other mathematical, perhaps, concepts. So don't let anyone tell you that the forms don't appear in Theaetetus. Here they are, the elementary forms that will continue to be discussed in the Parmenides and in the Sophists. By what organ do we make? Do we perceive being, not being, other, same, like, alike? What organ do we use? Sight? Hearing? Taste? What organ? Theaetetus answers, the psyche views by itself directly what all things have in common. The psyche views by itself, this is actually not the translation here, but this is the translation in my Lerb edition. The psyche views by itself directly what all things have in common. And later it adds, and later we then get beautiful, ugly, good and bad. I'm hearing a bit of noise, thank you. Later we get good, ugly, beauty, ugly, good and bad. So remember those, remember good and bad, the form of the good and the form of beauty we've discussed in other dialogues, right? Two standard forms that we find in the Republic and the Phaedo and so on. So it's no doubt here we're talking about the forms, right? So we've gone to those higher forms, we've gone to beauty, ugly, beautiful, ugly, good and bad. But then right at the end of our reading today, let's see what then happens. Okay, so I'm reading from here. Okay, and this is the last bit of the reading and the last bit of my talk. Okay, so does the psyche not perceive the hardness of the heart? So we're talking about, say, touching my cup. You know, what about, does the psyche also perceive the hardness of the hard through touch? And likewise, the softness of the soft. So remember this, the opposition, soft and hard, if you've done the Republic of the fingers, right? Yes, but their essential nature and the fact that they exist, softness and hardness, that they exist, and their opposition to one another, the opposites, the opposite nature of soft and hard, right? Remember, that's a fundamental, you know, remember the one as opposite. And in turn, the essential nature of their opposition, the psyche itself tries to determine for us by reverting to them and comparing them with one another. Is it not true then that all sensations which reach the psyche through the body, so the sense data that reaches the psyche, can be perceived by human beings and also by animals from the moment of birth? So you have your sense data from the moment of birth, right? But what changes between birth and where we are now? Think about that. Whereas reflections about these, with reference to their being, their usefulness, are acquired, if at all, with difficulty and slowly, through many troubles. In other words, through learning or education. Assuredly, says Theaetetus, is it then possible for one to attain truth who cannot even get as far as being? So being is something that the being of something is something that the psyche determines in itself. No, says Theaetetus. And will a man ever have knowledge of anything, the truth of which he fails to attain? How can he, Socrates? Then knowledge is not in the sensations, but in the process of reasoning about them. For it is possible, apparently, to apprehend being and truth by reasoning, but not by sensations. It's possible, apparently, to apprehend being and truth by reasoning, but not by sensations. So it seems, says Theaetetus. Then will you call the two by the same name when there are so many differences between them? Perception and knowledge, there's so many differences between them. No, that would certainly not be right, said Theaetetus. What name will you give then to the one which includes seeing, hearing, smelling, being cold, and being hot? Perceiving. What other name would I give it? Collectively, what would you call it? Perception? Of course. By which, says Socrates, we say we are quite unable to apprehend truth. Can't apprehend truth by perception. We just said that. We can't apprehend being by perception. We just said that. Since we cannot apprehend being either. No, certainly not. Nor knowledge either. No. Then, Theaetetus, perception and knowledge could never be the same. Okay, and that's the end of our reading. Yes, okay. Andrew, did you want to add anything to that passage? Because I know we talked about that before the class.
Yeah, you may or may not remember by now, but earlier in the dialogue at 152C, it is, if you want to look it up, that Socrates says there are two marks of knowledge that has to be identified. One is that knowledge is something that is, and he's saying here that and it has to be infallible. And saying here that perception is not of being. So that's one reason why it's failed. From right at the beginning, they were saying that it has to be infallible and of something that is. And here they're saying it's not even of something that doesn't grasp being. So it's not something of this. So that, but I'd completely agree with what Bernie was saying earlier, that it's a really important passage, that especially how we have 5 windows to the world, if you like, with the 5 different senses, that our mind somehow integrates them all into one coherent experience. And how the mind does that is quite mysterious, really. It's a power in us that manages to do this somehow. And that's but the mind also can perceive the intelligible things that we don't see through our senses. So the mind seems to have this dual function of combining our senses into one integrated package, but also of seeing you know, the forms of things and so on. So it seems to have this dual function. So that's how Plato ends the first hypothesis, and then Theaetetus is going to start a second hypothesis and move on with that.
In the meantime, yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. My own view, the only thing I would change in what Andrew said is window to the world. I would say window to experience. So I think for me, that's an important distinction there. It's a suggestion of an external world when you use that language. So, I mean, perhaps the main point we can think about here is when we make the distinction, well, this might be a clearer one because this is something we've been doing before. When we make, say, a distinction between the sound of the wet freeway, you know, and the sound of the ocean, you know, something like that that's very similar, and we can make a distinction between the two sounds and say, oh no, that's the sound of that the ocean makes. The waves make on the beach. When we make a distinction, right, the act of making a distinction and that part of what knowledge is, or distinguish between the like and the unlike, the same and the other, that doesn't come from perception. And so he's sort of saying, well, where does that come from? So he's turning us around. He's turning the mind's eye around and saying, let's pay attention to these forms. All right, I have definitely said enough. I'm going to throw it over to people to make their comments.
Can I ask a question, Bernie? In your translation that you were reading from, it talks of psyche. The Penguin translation talks of the mind. So what was the Greek word? I don't have the original Greek.
Okay, so my translation actually says soul, and I just threw in, I should have said, I threw in psyche because psyche's in the original Greek, or psyche.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just put that in because yeah, mind has problems, especially when you're reading other ancient Greek philosophy, if you're reading Aristotle.
Thank you.
Connotations, yeah. So it is the old psyche, and so when Plato uses the mind's eye, it's the psyche's eye. So yeah, mind, psyche, soul, translated into Latin as anima, and then into English from anima to soul. Yeah. Okay, anyone else?
I was really pleased to see the development of the argument get to this point where they say, well, perception is not just what we experience through the senses. It's not just that physical hearing, seeing. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah, so what you get in this discussion is you get this kind of opposition between what you see of the external in modern philosophy, what you see of the external world, your through your senses, and what you apply a priori. So you might apply logic and mathematics and that sort of thing. So in modern philosophy, you have you experience the external world. This isn't Plato. Experience the external world through your senses, and then you apply your a priori knowledge, your logic, your mathematics, or whatever, to interpret them. And so there's this mixture between remember the opposite a priori now, a posteriori. A posteriori, this is Latin here, sorry, all you Greeks. So much of this has come from the Latin. A posteriori, after you experience, and a priori, before you experience. And there's this kind of mixture of the two, right? And so in a way that matches with Plato, but it doesn't in an important way, because Plato's talking about your experience, not projecting then to the external world. Because remember, in our reflection we did at the very beginning of the class, your experience is in you, right? And so your objects of experience are in you. They may not be caused by you, but they're in you. So a priori experience, and then in modern philosophy, they jump to the external object, which gives you your experience. Okay. How are you going, Helen? I'm exhausted. How are you going? I'm John.
Here I am.
Yeah.
So does that all link the social knowledge, that it's right for the culture and so it's right for society? Does that then link, I guess, with the ancient Greeks moving into politics and the legal side of things, the democracy side of things? Like the way you perceive things, and I was thinking, you know, how we all make different decisions about COVID and the sort of regulations, and you see each country doing their own thing. Is that where that sort of, that idea of perception, then thinking, then knowledge, and then obviously laws, did that all sort of flow like that?
Oh, it's a big question. A couple of things on that. I suppose it's like, on one hand, it's foundations of science, you know, like what is knowledge and how should we pursue knowledge, and how should we make our knowledge better? There's that side of things. I mean, another side of what you're saying is where he was talking about truth, I suppose, being relative. So if you think of, like, if you think in an anthropological sort of way, you think, you know, you go and see a tribe, or you go into very different cultures or whatever, and they have their own cultural truths. And so he was actually saying, yeah, well, okay, and to a certain extent, what is true and real in that, you know, tribal culture that's very different from ours, or is real to that culture and true, and what Protagoras is saying is right, you know, in terms of that social knowledge for that group. What is true to that group is true. But then he pulled back. Remember, he pulled back from that, and he says, yeah, well, for some things it is right, but then you can say, well, you know, like if you're talking about the security of the organization, or, you know, in modern societies introducing new laws, and you think that law will be good for society or not. Well, if you look around at all the city-states in ancient Greek, sometimes, you know, they would say, oh, well, sometimes someone introduced a law, it did badly. We all agree it did badly, or maybe some of us agree and some of us don't. So you can have good and bad laws, or you can have good and bad decisions on someone's health. So yeah, he was kind of drawing those distinctions there. I don't think I've answered your question.
No, I think that's, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Maybe it helps. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyone else?
Can I ask about continuous references, which I've just become aware of, to the girls from Thrace or Thrace or whatever you call it in English? What is the significance of these girls? Oh,
right. Okay. No, it's a very simple thing. It's a very simple thing. So it's a myth about, I call him Thales. So he's considered to be, is a bit like Pythagoras. He's considered, and he's before Pythagoras, I think, his dates. He's considered to be the founder of Greek science. Okay, and his follower was Anaximander, and we supposedly have some fragments of Anaximander, so we know a little bit of what Anaximander thought, but very little about Thales. And so there's lots of stories. There were stories about Thales in Plato's time, and one of the stories was that he was so obsessed, so interested in his science of astronomy, that and that he wasn't paying attention to where he was going. And he fell into a well, right? And he got stuck in this well, and then this girl came along and saw him stuck into the well and says, well, what are you doing down in the well? He said, oh, well, I was looking at the stars and I wasn't looking where I was going and I fell into the well. And she laughed at him and called him a stupid fool. Right. So that was referred to a bit further back, and then he keeps bringing it up. He's saying, well, the opinion of that girl is not the opinion that we're interested in.
But he says the girls, was it more than one girl?
I think it's like the types, you know. I'm not talking
Just
about the
trying to find where it
ScoMos of
is.
the. I'm not talking about the ScoMos of this world, something like that. You know,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay,
I think
Yep,
that's what
yep,
it is.
yep.
Yeah.
Got
Yeah.
it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, that was a really heavy week, guys. I hope it was rewarding, and I hope I've given you something to reflect on, so you can engage a bit deeper with Plato in relation to what you know about your own consciousness and your own experience, and so you can engage with that a bit more, and it's not just kind of words out there, weird stuff. So and thanks for your commitment. I really do appreciate the way everyone's attempting to engage with this. I really enjoy that, and it's very rewarding for me. So thank you. So next week we can hang around, but I know some people are probably racing off to dinner. But next week, after the knowledge is perception thing has been completely destroyed, as Andrew said, we move on to another approach. We're still pointing down, but we move on to another approach. And Plato explores a possible way out, where he talks about, takes the tact of true and false opinion. Okay, maybe it's all about opinion, and then we've just got to determine what's true and false opinion, right? And perhaps knowledge is opinion, and this is judged to be true. That's what truth is. But this raises a question about this judgment, and about whether you can even make a judgment about whether that an opinion is false. I mean, what is it false to? Or what is it true to? So we come back to this reference again. What are you going to ground your knowledge in? And this leads us actually into a theme, as Andrew knows, that comes up in the Parmenides and the Sophists, where we're kind of getting the answer. So I hope you enjoy the reading next week about true and false opinion, and we will chat about it at this time next Tuesday. So thanks, guys. Great effort. And we will continue on with this quite advanced Plato. You know, pat yourselves on the back. This is hard stuff, and I think you're doing pretty well. So I'm going to turn the video off now, and do stick around if you want to. Okay, but bye for now.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Bernie.